بسم الله الرحمن الرحیم. خوش آمدین و امروز به اتحادیه های کارگرای افغانستان و قانونهای کارگران از طرف دولت افغانستان به خیر گپ میزنیم. Hello and welcome. Today we will talk about the Afghan labor laws as they relate to unions and labor relations in collective bargaining agreements. So we will talk about the Afghan labor laws as presented by the Afghan Constitution, and we'll review some of those, but first we will do a general overview of labor relations, unions, and collective bargaining agreements as they relate to the International Labor Organization's laws and definitions or principles and concepts. And then I'll give you some highlights of some of the Afghan labor laws, and hopefully you can find out the remaining labor laws and conduct some research by applying some of those labor laws into the Afghan workplace. So you'll determine which ones are readily applicable and have been applied effectively and which ones require more training or awareness on the part of employers or employees. So that's the agenda for today on Afghan labor laws. Let me ask you this question. Do we have labor laws in Afghanistan regarding unions? In other words, does the Afghan Constitution or the Afghan labor law specify anything about unions? Or maybe, let me ask you this question. Do we have unions in Afghanistan? Are you aware of any unions? We'll talk about the answers to these questions a little bit later. So we'll come back to it, but keep thinking about, do we have unions in Afghanistan? And do we have labor laws related to unions in Afghanistan? So two questions that we'll review a little bit later on. So when we're talking about labor laws, obviously I'm presenting Michael Corral and Christina Havren's textbook for you. That's because this is what I'm familiar with. I've been here in the United States for over 35 years. So I practiced this as a corporate manager, but also as a professor here at Nova Southeastern University. I use this textbook for my master's students. So your first point is obviously to get your master's degree by becoming familiarized with all of these labor relations laws and union discussions from international point of view. The second point is that you need to apply this material as a corporate manager, as a professional, as a human resource expert in the field. You need to apply this in every single workplace in Afghanistan. So those are two aspects. First is the academic side, which is what I'm going to teach you. And so while I admit that this is not necessarily applicable in all countries or in Afghanistan, so I'm not saying that the laws presented in the United States or in Europe are better than the Asian or Afghan laws. No, absolutely not. What I'm saying is that for academic purposes, to earn your master's degree, and to have the same international credentials as anybody else around the world, when you speak about academic credentials in research related to labor relations in unions and collective bargaining. So when you're understanding the international rules and policies or European or American laws or Canadian laws, hopefully you can write from an Afghan perspective, but also from international perspective, so your articles can be published in international journals. So that will prepare you to go on to the PhD programs and also to publish and hopefully teach at a university level in Afghanistan or in foreign countries. And obviously, hopefully, all of you will be teaching in Afghanistan, preparing all of our future leaders and future students and future researchers to be competitive internationally. Let us talk about an overview of labor relations laws in this lecture, as well as a few of the labor laws in Afghanistan. And then you can take it from there by doing more research in terms of how the Afghan labor laws are being practiced and what else we need to do to create awareness about those labor laws among the workers and among the employers, as well as among the managers, and more specifically among the human resources professionals and specialists. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. First of all, labor relations, as we've mentioned in the previous lectures, could be any activity between the managers in the unions or employees related to negotiations or implementation of collective bargaining agreements that have been signed by both union representatives as well as by the corporation, the company, or the managers. So a collective bargaining agreement is any written and signed document between the employer entity in a labor organization which specifies the terms and conditions of the employment for a specific period of time for the workers and obviously the manager's side in commitment as well. Labor union is basically an organization that usually represents the employees or the workers of an organization. So labor unions are organizations of workers that are dedicated to protect the employees' interest in any workplace, as well as to improve their salaries or earnings, to give them better working hours in maybe 8 working hours as opposed to 15 or 16 working hours, and also to improve working conditions. So that's what labor unions usually do, to provide a better workplace for employees. This way they can be productive, at the meantime make a good living that they can support their family with as a result of their laws. There are 3 common types of unions. You have trade unions or craft unions, you have industrial unions, and then you have public sector unions. Sometimes the public sector unions are very similar to the private sector. However, sometimes there are some differences because when you're working for the government, there are going to be more strict laws that you have to abide by, where private corporations are not necessarily required to be following the same rules as public or government sector employees. Trade unions represent workers in a single occupation like engineering or welding or carpentry or masonry. So regardless of their work, that's basically their job, to represent one single occupation, regardless of which organization, company, or even private or public sector working. So one example of a trade union would be the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers in Canada. So it's very common in the construction industry. So if I'm working in, let's say, microbiology, or if I'm a professor, I may not be aware of the International Brotherhoods of Electrical Workers, but somebody who's working in the construction industry, he or she would know, he or she might be a member, or at least he or she might be benefiting from the work that those trade unions are doing to provide better wages and better working hours for the employees. On the other hand, industrial unions represent all workers in a specific industry, regardless of the job that they perform. So in the health industry, in the, let's say, education industry, or in the petroleum industry, so one industry's workers are represented regardless of what they do. An example of this would be the Canadian Auto Workers Union, or CAW. So the CAW represents workers in the automobile industry, whether they are on the assembly line or in maintenance. It doesn't matter which department they work, they're all going to be represented by the same union. Those are industrial unions. Public sector unions represent workers who are employed by any of the levels of government. So whether it's at the state, at the federal, at the local level, does not matter. Those individuals will be represented by the public sector unions. So an example of this would be Public Service Alliance of Canada, PSAC. So Canadian Union of Public Employees, CUPE. So these are, again, 2 examples of public sector unions that you can see around the globe. Collective bargaining is a concern that is there in terms of having a good relationship between trade unions and the management or owners of the organization. Bargaining is collective because the chosen representatives of labor and management tend to act as a bargaining agent or as bargaining agents. Collective bargaining generally refers to a process in which employers, on the one hand, and representative of the employees on the other side, attempt to arrive at agreements which cover the conditions under which employees will contribute and be compensated fairly for their service, for their time, for their hard work, and for their qualifications and expertise. So the general objectives of collective bargaining can include to provide an opportunity to the workers to voice their problems on issues that are related to employment. Second would be to facilitate reaching a solution that's acceptable to all parties, in other words, the employees as well as the managers. Third is to resolve all conflicts and disputes in a mutually agreeable manner. Fourth would be to present any conflict or dispute in the future through mutually signed contracts. Fifth is to develop a work atmosphere or an environment that fosters good industrial relations between all sides. And six would be to provide stable and peaceful industrial relations in the organization. Seven would be to enhance the productivity of an organization by preventing strikes, lockouts, or picketing or sickouts in other forms of, let's say, strikes that may happen as a result of conflict between employees and managers in the organization. There are three different levels of collective bargaining. So bargaining level can be at the plant level, it could be at the industry level, or it could be at the national level between employees and managers. Some of the typical issues that are discussed in a collective bargaining could be wages, the working conditions, the work norms. In other words, who reports to who and who can basically change the rules and policies, and in what process: security of the job, changes in technology, training, grievances, disciplinary issues, health and safety, how much time can be taken off during a week, or what are employees entitled to in terms of their annual benefits for leaving for vacation, for taking care of elderly relatives or parents, let's say, and other issues that are of importance to employees, as well as the working conditions that they go through. So the process of collective bargaining usually means that there's a union that claims something, and there's managers who propose a solution to the claim. And between the union and the managers, they tend to negotiate between the two sides. The process of collective bargaining can be demonstrated through this visual that you see on the screen, where union and management have their claims and proposals, and they try to negotiate, and then sometimes they will need a third party to obviously lead them to this collective agreement that you see on this visual that both parties are aiming for. Sometimes the negotiation leads to a collective agreement between the two sides. Sometimes they have to use a third party, so that third party basically helps the two sides to negotiate and eventually come up with a collective agreement that is hopefully win-win for employees as well as for the company or managers. So generally speaking, the steps in collective bargaining could be for either side to prepare, to discuss, to propose, to bargain, and finally to settle toward an agreed upon contract. The steps involved in collective bargaining can include preparing, discussing, proposing, bargaining, and then having a settlement or collective agreement between the employee side and the manager side. So both parties hopefully can sign the contract and abide by them during the specified period of time. There's also the Industrial Labor Organization, or ILO, that you need to be aware of and become aware of the norms and practices that they recommend for all companies, all nations. So Industrial Labor Organization was created as an organization to keep peace within societies that are threatened by class divisions between capital and labor. In other words, to keep peace between employees and managers or owners of the organization. The Industrial Labor Organization was established in 1919. That was over 100 years ago. This was the only international body that survived even after World War II. It became specialized agency of United Nations around 1946, and it draws attention on various problems like working conditions, unemployment, industrial accidents, problems of women and children being abused in the workplace. Industrial Labor Organization is a tripartite body. It's a tripartite body, so representative of employer, labor, and government. There are at least 183 countries that are members of the International Labor Organization, so many countries obviously are members, and therefore they abide by the suggestions and recommendations of this International Labor Organization. There are basically a total of 9 principles which were written into the International Labor Organization's constitution. First of all, labor should not be treated as a commodity. Second, workers have the right to organize. Third, workers should get a reasonable wage to maintain a reasonable standard of living for their family members. 4, work should be limited to 8 hours a day, or a total of 48 hours per week. 5th, there should be 1 day of rest each week for workers. 6, no child labor in any organization, any plant. In 7, there should be equal pay for equal work between men and women, between people who are older and younger, between people who are from different ethnicities and different languages, between the majority and the minority, as long as they are doing the same work with the same qualifications. Number 8, there should be equitable treatment of all minorities and immigrants. And finally, the enforcement of the labor law should be consistent. So those are some of the International Labor Organization's principles. The goal for us is to align all of our rules with the ILO, and if the ILO principles are not necessarily always aligned with the local cultures, then we have to go above and beyond that to do more than what the ILO is expecting us to be aligned with them, and then to be ethical and moral by going above and beyond them in terms of treating our local workers with respect and dignity that they deserve. So earlier I asked you, can there be participation of employees in labor unions in Afghanistan? In other words, does the law allow it? Well, the answer is obviously yes. We do have at least 2 different union organizations in Afghanistan, and the Afghan labor laws do allow for participation of employees in labor unions in Afghanistan. So yes, Afghan employees can participate in labor unions in Afghanistan according to the labor laws of Afghanistan. For example, you can look at Article 147, which states that اشتراک کارکنان در اتحادیه کارگری ماده 147 اول اتحادیه های کارکنان و کارفرمایان سازمان های اجتماعی بوده که با اشتراک داوطلبانه اصناف مربوط با رعایت احکام قانون سازمان های اجتماعی ایجاد می گردد. دوم، اتحادیه های منترج فقرای اول این ماده از جانب دولت یا سازمان های سیاسی تمویل یا سبسایدی شده نمی تواند. سوم، کارکنان حق شمول در اتحادیه های مربوط را دارا می باشند. So workers in Afghanistan do have the right to participate in labor unions. And when it comes to disciplinary penalties for employees, the Afghan labor law specifies this in Article number 95. In case of violating labor discipline, disciplinary penalties, as the case may be, shall be applied concerning the employee as follows. First, advise the employee to correct it. Second, give him or her a warning of the consequences. Third, deduct his or her salary or wage. Fourth would be transfer of the employee. Or number 5, abrogation, in other words, abolition or termination or ending of labor contract with that employee. assuming that the previous 4 steps did not work. So it's really nice to see that the Afghan labor law is so specific, offering advice, suggestions on how to conduct fair, ethical, and legal employee-employment relations in the Afghan workplace. In cases of layoffs, whether it's international employers or national employers, Article number 49 says, first, except as provided otherwise by the law, government, non-government, mixed or private entities shall not be authorized to dismiss all or a group of their employees without the approval of the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. Second, in case of long-term work stoppage that results in closing the administration down, the administration must inform the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs of the matter 3 months in advance. So when you look at Japan, when you look at European countries, when you look at North American countries, all of them have specific rules and policies both for local firms as well as international firms. So it's really good to see the Afghan law is very clear and somewhat fair both to international firms and local firms, so employees can be treated fairly. In 3 months is probably good enough time for employees to prepare the transition and to find another job. So the Afghan laws are clearly written for you, and you have a sample of them here in this presentation, but hopefully you can look at the Ministry of Labor and download all the laws, become aware of them, understand them, as managers apply them, and make sure you abide by them in all cases. And in the future, when you have opportunities, try to research them, write about them, and also propose maybe additional details for each one so future managers, local or international, can abide by them fairly, ethically, and obviously legally. The more you understand the Afghan labor laws, the more clear they are to you, the more you apply them as managers to your employees, your department, your organizations, the more likely you'll be able to also academically research and obviously provide good ways of how other managers can abide by those labor laws so all employees in Afghanistan can be treated fairly, ethically, and legally. And if they feel satisfied, then there's usually no need for union membership. But if employees do not feel satisfied with their managers and work practices, then obviously they will join unions, and the union will force changes onto the employers. So the question is, can there be participation of employees in labor unions in Afghanistan? Is your answer yes or no? Obviously, the answer is yes, and I'm sure most of you are aware of already and familiar with this, and some of you might be even members of a specific union in Afghanistan. But if you're not, at least we now know that the answer is yes. So if you look at this Article 147, it specifies that Afghan workers can participate in labor unions. اشتراک کارکنان در اتحادیه کارگری ماده 147 اول اتحادیه‌های کارکنان و کارفرمایان سازمان‌های اجتماعی بوده که با اشتراک داوطلبانه اصناف مربوط با رعایت احکام قانون سازمان‌های اجتماعی ایجاد می‌گردد. دوم اتحادیه‌های مندرج فقره اول این ماده از جانب دولت یا سازمان‌های سیاسی تمویل یا سبسایدی شدن نمی‌توانند. سوم کارکنان حق شمول در اتحادیه‌های مربوط را دارا میباشند. So Article 147 does provide all Afghan employees to be involved in labor unions. So you can see that the Afghan labor law does provide rights for employees to form into unions and to participate in unions. Therefore, if you're a manager or an employer, you should know that employees do have the right and obviously allow them to form unions if they feel it's appropriate for them. But if you're an owner or a manager, your first job should be to treat your employees fairly, ethically, and with dignity so they can be satisfied and happy employees. And this way, when there is a problem or a challenge, they can come to you and talk about their issues. When employees are satisfied and happy, they don't need to form into labor unions. But when employees are not paid well, the working conditions are not good, and the managers or bosses are being abusive, then obviously they have no choice but to form a collective voice so they all can get better working conditions and hopefully voice their input into the decisions that impact their working conditions. So I would like for you to review all of these articles in the Afghan Labor Law by yourself, become familiarized with them one by one, and try to understand them so you as a manager can apply them fairly with all your workers. And also, if you're a professional employee, you need to know what your rights are so you can request those rights from your bosses and employers in the private or public sector workplace. Article number 2 says the law shall have the following objectives. Number 1, specify, regulate, and strengthen the work relations of employees. Number 2, ensure equal job opportunity and protect the rights of employees. Number 3, improve the organization of work and production, promote work efficiency, ensure reasonable utilization of human resources and labor resources, strengthen work discipline and production, promote advanced salary and payment systems, and ensure Social Security to upgrade the material, social, and cultural life of the employees. Number 4, determine rights and responsibilities of employees and those in charge of work and production. Employers need to ensure compliance with requirements of protection and work safety techniques, and there should be continuous skills in capacity building for purpose of development and strengthening of the national economy. 5, promote the rule of law in uniform application of legislative documents governing labor in all aspects of work and production. Number 6, facilitate the provision of placement of services. So those are the objectives of the Afghan Labor Law that you need to abide by in all cases, especially when you're a manager. See, article number 4 talks about prohibition of forced labor. Forced labor shall be prohibited. Number 1, work shall be deemed forced when the employee is obliged to perform it by menaces or otherwise against his or her will. Number 2, any work, the performance of which is required by the law, shall not be deemed forced labor. So be very careful if you're an employer or a manager to make sure you are not forcing people into specific jobs. It has to be all volunteer work. And also, Afghan laws talk about child labor laws. Make sure you are legally following the laws and not forcing young children to work. So if you are having an employee that's under the age of 18, again, look at the specific laws that apply for those who are 16 to 17 years of age and abide by those. So all countries try to protect their citizens, so you have to be aware of those laws and treat every worker in the country fairly, with dignity and the respect that they deserve. And you can only do this by being aware of these laws and giving each worker the right that they are guaranteed by the Afghan Constitution and the Afghan Labor Laws. You should also know the terms of employment. Article 13 clearly says that a person who may be employed as an employee shall be 18 years of age. And if they're 15 to 18 years of age, they should work in light industries. We do not want children to be abused. Therefore, we have to abide by the laws in employing workers. And when it comes to disciplinary penalties for employees, Article number 95 says in case of violating labor disciplines, disciplinary penalties, as the case may be, shall be applied concerning the employee as follows. First, advice. Second, warning. Third, deduction of salary or wage. Fourth, transfer of employee. Or number 5, abrogation. In other words, abolition or ending of the labor contract. So there has to be a process followed to be fair to the employees and obviously to managers. In your textbook, we call this due process. Employees shall have a right to basically argue their side. If you're following this process, hopefully the employee can correct his or her behavior or the misunderstanding that has taken place between the manager and the employee. On the other hand, if the employee does not correct his or her behavior, then obviously you have to terminate the employee, and he or she can find something that's more suitable for his or her interest, and you can get a new employee that is going to be more productive for your company and for the national economy as well. So I would like for you to review all of these laws in the Afghan labor law. I have provided some of these for you here at the end of this video. Good luck to you in understanding the Afghan labor laws and, more importantly, applying them into your day-to-day workplaces, whether you're an employee or whether you're a manager. Good luck.
دلم دیوانه بود دیوانه تر شد دیوانه تر شد طبیب آمد به بالینم بتر شد طبیب آمد به بالینم بتر شد طبیب آمد دوای عاشقی داد عاشقی داد دوای عاشقی خون جگر شد دوای عاشقی خون جگر شد سری راحت بسازم خانه عشق خانه عشق کبوتر می شوم در لانه عشق کبوتر می شوم در لانه عشق سری راحت بسازم خانه عشق خانه عشق کبوتر می شوم در لانه عشق کبوتر می شوم در لانه عشق زی احوالم خبرداری نداری داری نداری بسای ما نظرداری نداری بسای ما نظرداری نداری مکی مردم به این شهر مسافر شهر مسافر سر خاکم گذرداری نداری سر خاکم گذرداری نداری سری راحت بسازم خانه عشق خانه عشق کبوتر می شوم در لانه عشق کبوتر می شوم در لانه عشق سری راحت بسازم خانه عشق خانه عشق کبوتر می شوم در لانه عشق کبوتر می شوم در لانه عشق شمالک میزنه با برگ گندم با برگ گندم مسافری کدام در خاک مردم مسافری کدام در خاک مردم مسافری نموده خار گشتم دلم میشه به خاک خود بگردم دلم میشه به خاک خود بگردم سر راهت بسازم خانه عشق کبوتر میشوم در لانه عشق کبوتر میشوم در لانه عشق سر راحت بسازم خانه عشق کبوتر میشوم در لانه عشق کبوتر میشوم در لانه عشق